Hey, this is Matt from the Woodworking Nook. Today we're going to build a round coffee table out of plywood and white oak. I decided to buy a smaller project panel for this since I didn't need a full sheet of plywood. I know I would have gotten leftovers from that and probably used it in a later project, but this was pretty much exactly what I needed, so I decided to buy this instead. It really helps out on your back using these smaller project panels. This plywood will act as the interior core of the coffee table. So the coffee table will have the plywood as the interior core and then have white oak edging around the edges and then layered with the white oak veneer. It's really nice to be cutting on a flat surface again. I recently redid my workbench and added all these new holes. So if you haven't checked that video out yet, I'll have it linked above. And if you're new here, my name is Matt and this is the Woodworking Nook. Here I try to build quality furniture with economical tools in a small shop. My primary cutting tool is my track saw that you see here, and other various small power tools that you see on my wall there. So if that's something that you're interested in, please hit that subscribe button to follow along. What I'm doing now is I am cutting the edges of each of the top and bottom plywood cores so that I can glue on the hardwood edging. And since it's going to be a circle, I need to make it an octagon so that it makes it a little bit easier to glue on the hardwood edging. My new track saw hinge makes it a little bit easier to cut these. So I just lift it up and rotate the plywood. So the next step is to cut down the white oak that we have. This white oak is 13/16 of an inch thick, which gives us extra room when we glue it on the plywood to cut it flush. So right now I am just outlining where I need to cut each piece to make sure that I calculated everything correctly and will have enough for the edging and the legs. And this is a good example of how to do crosscuts with the track saw. I recently showed a video of me getting kickback when doing a crosscut on the track saw. Unfortunately, I think some people took it the wrong way and thought that you could not do crosscuts on a track saw, but you certainly can as long as you have it clamped down properly. And then I have a stop block clamped down on the side so that it can make repeatable cuts on each one. The next step was to rip the pieces down to their width for the edging and the table legs. In hindsight, I should have waited to rip the table legs and just glue them first and then rip them to length. That way it would have been a lot easier to remove the glue squeeze out when I glue them together. The process of ripping smaller boards with the track saw is pretty easy as long as you have it set up properly. I have two pieces supporting the length of the piece that's being ripped, and I usually put painter's tape down just to kind of hold it together a little bit better, but there's also the pressure of the track saw coming down that holds everything together nicely. I finally decided to switch out my track saw blade. I had bought this blade a few months back and just never put it on. I usually clean my blades, but this one made quite the difference. It said on the packaging that it was quieter, and I didn't really believe it until I used it, and man, it was a lot quieter. Plus, it cut through like butter and left no burn marks. The next step was to laminate the legs together so that the glue could dry on them while we work on other parts of the coffee table. So we'll set this aside until they're dry. Now it is time to attach the hardwood edging to the interior core of the coffee table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the biscuit joiner to attach each of the pieces of edging. This will help keep it flat and flush to one side, and I'll only need to trim flush the other side. So going around and using the biscuit joiner to add biscuits to the center of each side of the coffee table. Then I'll do the same for each edge piece and cut the biscuit in the center of each piece. And I'll repeat these steps for both the top and bottom shelf of the coffee table. Since the coffee table is a circle, each of the edge banding pieces needs to be thicker. That way the circle can cut through them and not have an issue exposing the plywood. Now it's time to attach each piece to the plywood core. And this process is a little bit more tedious since we have to cut and measure each piece. So you'll attach the piece first and cut a 90-degree angle on one edge, and then cut a 45-degree angle on the other edge that lines up with the previous 90-degree. So again, you'll see me reference the 45-degree angle there and then mark the 90-degree angle for the next piece. As you work on each of these processes, you do tend to get a little bit better and learn from your mistakes. This was the top piece of the coffee table, and on the second piece you'll see I start gluing the edge pieces as I'm going around the edging, and this helps keep everything super tight. So you'll want to glue each piece as you're cutting them and reference the previous one on your next cut. And I use these bar clamps to help clamp each one down. That way it has some time in the clamps before adding the painter's tape. And this kept everything pretty snug and tight. Now a question you might be asking yourself is, why not build the whole coffee table out of white oak instead of using the edging, the plywood, and the veneer for the coffee table? And that's a very good question. The main reason being is the tools that I have access to. So being a smaller shop, I don't have access to a joiner or a planer that would help make the boards flat and straight. And if you were to buy lumber from the hardware store that's been surfaced on all four sides, that's gonna cost a ton of money. Plus with the veneer, it tends to have a pretty consistent grain pattern, which makes it a little bit easier. So the next step is to clean up the edges on the coffee table legs. In hindsight, I should have glued them together first and then ripped them. So this would have been done in one process, but here we are. So just trimming a very small bit off of each side to remove the glue squeeze out and the burning from each of the coffee table legs. This also significantly reduced my sanding time later on. The next step was to trim flush each of the panels so that when attaching the veneer, everything sat completely flush. So I'm going to be using my high quality flush trimming jig, which is just two pieces of wood stuck together. I do want to try to make a more official jig for this so that this process doesn't take quite as long. I am using a 1/2 inch wide mortise bit to do this process, and they have much bigger surfacing bits that I want to try and see if that will help speed up this process. Just checking to make sure everything is flush with the plywood. And since the router bit is exposed, you want to be careful not to dip the router down so that it cuts into your coffee table top. Once everything is trimmed flush, we're going to cut the circle out for the top and bottom of the coffee table. Again, this is a pretty simple jig. All it is a piece of wood that I attach to my router and then measure from the router bit to the center of that board on how wide I want my circle to be. So this circle will be 30 inches in diameter, so the radius will be 15. I originally thought I was going to cut all the way through with this jig, but that ended up being more work than it was worth, so I ended up using a jigsaw to cut out the rest and then use a flush trim bit to make sure everything is flush. And make sure to go slow with the flush trim bit. You don't want to get any tear out like I did here, but it wasn't too bad of a fix to just glue right back on. You'll repeat the same process for the bottom shelf of the coffee table. However, this diameter will be slightly smaller so that it sits inside the table legs of the coffee table. After that's finished up, it's time to get each piece ready for veneer. So you want to make sure you have a very flat surface for the veneer to adhere to. So there were a few holes that I needed to fix before adding the veneer. And then you want to make sure it's all sanded completely flush. If you have any divots or high spots, you will feel them through the veneer when you attach it. I got a piece of white oak veneer from VL Veneer. This sheet is 4 feet by 8 feet, which is the perfect size for the coffee table. I'm going to measure and cut each piece out, leaving each piece oversized by an inch. That way I have a half of an inch on each side of excess to give me room to position the piece of veneer. And I just use super sharp scissors to cut the veneer. Since this veneer is paperback, it allows me to use the scissors to cut the veneer. I don't believe that's the correct way to do it, but again, since it's paperback, I have not ever had an issue with it. Each piece of the coffee table will have veneer attached to both sides, but the bottom of the bottom shelf needed to have 2 pieces of veneer attached to each other to reach the correct size. To attach the 2 pieces of veneer together, I find the edge that I want to match up with the other veneer and trim them flush so that I can then take some painter's tape and tape them together, then fold them and use normal wood glue to bond them together. Then I'll let that dry before I attach it to the plywood. As soon as that was dry, it was time to prepare each piece to be veneered to the plywood. So you want to make sure all the dust is removed from both the veneer and the plywood. I'm going to be using this adhesive roller that I found to apply this contact cement. And the contact cement that I'm using is a water-based contact cement. And I used to use a paint tray to hold the contact cement, but found that pouring it on works just as good for me. And then I use a Ziploc bag to hold the roller while we wait between dry times. The contact cement will adhere immediately once you attach each piece together. So I use parchment paper or wax paper to put in between the plywood and the veneer so that I can position the veneer before attaching it down. And you'll want to slowly do this and work your way from the middle out. And I use a J roller to make sure everything is properly adhered together. On the bottle of contact cement, it does say that you can trim your veneer immediately after. And previously, I've always been intimidated on doing this because I don't want the veneer to pull up or anything happen to it. But this time I decided to just go for it, and it worked out great. Trimming it immediately after totally works and is totally safe. You do want to make sure you go around the edges again to make sure that it's fully adhered to the plywood. On the other side of the piece, you'll use the same process, but if you notice on the left there, I did mark which way the grain is going on the opposite side. That way I knew to match this piece of veneer with that same grain pattern. That way there was some alignment still with the piece. And make sure to go slow through this process. The contact cement does adhere immediately, and you don't want to mess up this late in the game. Once all the veneer was applied, it was time to sand down our connected area, and it actually turned out super well. I had a hard time telling the difference between each side a few times. Then we also want to add a 1/8 inch round over to all the sides. And you want to make sure to start on one of the veneer pieces so that you get the right depth set for the veneer. After that, we wanted to flush up all the legs for the coffee table. And then the bottom shelf is going to sit in a mortise in each leg. So I'm marking these out about 3 inches up from the bottom, and then marking out how thick that bottom shelf will be. And then just will use my mortising bit to cut this out. My palm router was not doing the job, so I moved over to my larger router to cut out this mortise. Once that was cut, I did a quick dry fit to make sure everything was fitting properly, and then moved on to marking out where the legs will actually go. To attach the legs to the top piece, I'm going to be using dowels. I'm not normally a fan of dowels, but in this application they worked out pretty well because I could use these little marking tabs to mark out where the dowels will go in the top piece. And this worked out pretty well. You do want to make sure that stop collar is attached super tight so that you don't go through the top piece all the way through the veneer on the other side. Then we do a dry fit again to make sure everything is fitting properly. And after that, I needed to do a quick sand of all the legs and the top and bottom shelf. I only did hand sanding on the top and bottom because I didn't want to sand right through the veneer. To glue it, I made sure to tape off all the edges where there could be glue squeeze out. And what I typically do before doing a glue up is I actually attach all the clamps that I'm going to attach and then remove them. That way I have kind of a game plan going into the glue up. I've had way too many glue ups where I'm frantic trying to get the clamps attached. This glue up went relatively smoothly. If you notice, I attached one too many legs, so I needed to remove one so that I could slide in that bottom piece and then reattach that leg on there. And then check for square to make sure all the legs are properly aligned. And then I leave it overnight. After the glue is dried, I remove all the clamps and remove all the painter's tape, and then do a final vacuuming of the coffee table before applying finish. For finish, I'm going to be applying Rustic Lumber's furniture oil. I've used this on many other projects in the past, and it works well and is pretty economical. So I apply a coat with a Scotch-Brite pad and then wipe off the excess. It's pretty easy to apply and looks great. It's always the best part of the project, applying the finish to your workpiece to see that grain pop and show through. And I think this one turned out pretty well. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. I'll see you all on the next video.